Hello, I'm Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Randy Baier, and we'll talk about some really interesting academic books. The first book I ran across in a review in the New York Times, Heretics, Activists, and One Scholar's Search for Justice. That has to be one of the most intriguing titles I've ever read.
And the middle finger is meant to be the profanity gesture, or is it meant to be something else and it's a trick?
Something else.
Okay.
That's what's so much fun about her writing, is that it goes in other directions than what you think it is. Because when I first ordered this book, I looked up the whole thing of finger signs, and in most Western cultures, the middle finger is regarded as obscene, it's a phallic symbol. But in Asian cultures, it's not. In Japanese culture, I think it is. The middle finger is a reference to the big brother, Ani.
Mm-hmm.
So, anyway, I thought, wow. And then I got into it, and she tells the story about how as a child, but first of all, she's a historian of medicine and science, and the author of Hermaphrodites and Medical Invention of Sex, and One of Us, Conjoined Twins in the Future of Normal. She lives in East Lansing, which I find fascinating.
But you have an opportunity to interview her on this program.
Yeah, right. But what was interesting is in the background, in the introduction, she talked about how when she was growing up, her family, her parents, were conservative Roman Catholics in their religious life. In fact, they were so conservative they wouldn't send their kids to Catholic schools because they didn't think the Catholic schools were conservative enough. Sent them to public schools. And then in their private lives, her mother was a feminist, a really aggressive, stick them in the eye kind of feminist. And they would have some really intriguing table discussions about different topics. And her mother had earned a degree in philosophy from Hunter College. So she would also read aloud to her kids from Plato and Shakespeare and analyze the texts that she read. And her father, who was a draftsman for one of the big Long Island defense contractors, loved learning in spite of having only a high school education. So these are really learners.
Right. Sounds like great parents. Great respect at home for learning.
And also just responsive to their environment. She told the story about how one day her father had summoned them all to see a giant UFO that appeared in the sky, and then found out it was a Goodyear blimp. And her folks, sought out Latin masses, avoided meat on Fridays long after Vatican II had declared all of this fuss unnecessary. But her folks were also rabble-rousers. Her mother helped lead the local chapter of Feminists for Life, and embraced American rights to speak, assemble, vote, and protest. So it's within that context that she became a historian, and what was interesting is that she decided to pursue a PhD in history and philosophy of science at Indiana University. But she kept this position of not accepting the given truths, and particularly sexist things like Harvard biologist Ruth Hubbard had taken apart the pseudoscientific claims that biology made women naturally less capable of doing science than men. So it's within that context that she started doing her research, and her research was on sexuality and gender and intersex, which means people who have a multiple sexual identity and gender, transgender, which I found really fascinating. And then and she says, she talked about the leadership of Beau Laurent, the founder of the Intersex Society of North America. And she noted that a couple wrote her simply to complain they found some of her language offensive, apparently not realizing I was relaying Victorian rhetoric in my article.
Oh, okay. She was doing it on purpose, in other words.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, tell us the secret. What's
that's what I'm getting to.
What's the middle finger?
Yeah. So
we have to parse the title before we can even get to the substance of the book.
But that's what's so delightful about this book is that so then she started a part of her research. Like I said, there was always this dichotomy of the supposed received truths and then what actually existed. She saw that was the role of the scholar is to define that, particularly in terms of human identity. So she said, very often during this strange trip, I was stuck in some airport on layover. I found myself meditating on the image of Galileo's middle finger. I actually came upon that mummified digit 2 decades ago on a trip in graduate school just at the start of my scholarly work on the history of hermaphrodites. She'd gone to Italy to accompany her mother on a tour of Roman Catholic religious sites. There was always this religious thing.
Right, a very heavy Catholic.
And her mother flew back to America while she continued around Europe to supplement her studies. And she went to a museum attached to the Uffizi art galleries. And she noted that, when Galilei was born, the world had just started changing the direction that ultimately led to modern science, modern technology, and democracy. The old way of accepting authorities without question had just started to develop serious cracks. So they had started dissecting, bodies to see how things really worked. And then Galileo argued for a bold way of knowing, openly insisting that what mattered was not what the authorities, ancient or otherwise, said was true, but what anyone with the right tools could show was true. He made the case for modern science. I'm getting to the explanation.
It's okay. No, I'm because
it's a good story,
Yeah.
Galileo's radical new way of thinking, following his perfect display in one particular argument he had with a colleague over a vital and timeless question from the physical sciences: whether you could cook a bird's egg by whirling around your head in a sling. This hypothetical problem represented a larger physics question about whether flying objects heat up or cool down. But Galileo turned into an even bigger question. How do we know if something is true? And his contemporary debate partner in this topic was a Jesuit scientist named Orazio Grassi. Like most people of his time, Grassi usually accepted the word of the ancient authorities, and because ancient authorities reported that Babylonians had managed to cook eggs by twirling around in a sling, Grassi figured this was true.
I mean, all of modern science comes down to this question. It's
but Galileo mocked this silly claim, and in so doing, explained how one could personally test ideas about cause and effect by controlling for variables. And then he wrote, if we do not achieve an effect by cooking an egg by whirling it, which others have formerly achieved, it must be that in our operations we lack something which was the cause of this effect succeeding. And if we lack but one single thing, this alone can be the cause. Now, we do not lack legs, eggs, or slings, or sturdy fellows to whirl them, and still they do not cook, but they rather cool down faster if hot. And since nothing is lacking to us except being Babylonians, then Babylonians must be the cause of the egg hardening. So anyway, what he was saying is that's not what he found, to be true. And then, while he was doing this approach toward using actual evidence, is when he found the telescope, which is a brand new optical device, and he constructed his own, and then a better one, and a better one. and enlarged his radical epistemology of nature, turned his telescope to the sky. And what did he see? Not at all the perfect geocentric heavens as they were described by the ancients and taught at the universities. No, indeed, the Earth's moon had mountains, a sign of imperfection. Jupiter had its own moons, a sign that not everything orbited around the Earth. Venus had phases, a sign of heliocentrism. Throughout the sky, Galileo saw evidence of Copernicus' radical new astronomical model. So he's in the middle of this thing of, trying to prove what he saw and go by that. And the telescope became a tool to investigate not only stars but also the human condition. He described a messy universe in which humans are on just a whizzing planet, not a special still place made for us by the attendant biblical God, and thus strayed dangerously close to the source of ideas that had gotten his contemporary Giordano Bruno convicted of heresy. So I'm still getting to the story here. So in May 1993, I expected that what St. Peter's Basilica would have been to my mother on our trip to Italy, the Florence Museum room now contained Galileo's telescopes would be to me. The next day, a few hours before I had to leave Florence, the part of the Uffizi that held the history of science collection opened. The docent handed me an English language self-guided tour of the show, and I moved slowly from item to item, pausing especially to appreciate the evolution the telescope had enjoyed in Galileo's own hands. Eventually, I came upon a strange object, a relic. Like the religious relics my mother and I had just visited all over England, perched on an alabaster pillar, protected under a beautiful dome of glass. This, the guidebook explained, was Galileo's middle finger.
Mummified? She said mummified earlier.
But what had happened is that some devotee chopped off Galileo's middle finger and arranged this little shrine.
Incredible.
And then a fellow named Tommaso Pirelli provided a Latin inscription for the marble. This is the finger belonging to the illustrious hand that ran through the skies, pointing at the immense spaces and singling out new stars, offering to the senses a marvelous apparatus of crafted glass, and with wise daring they could reach where neither Enceladus nor Tiphys ever reached. Those are the giants who stormed heaven. And she says, I knew that in Italy, sticking your middle finger up doesn't mean what it means in the United States, but the more I thought about it, more about Galileo's contentious nature, his belief in the righteousness of science, his ego, his burning knowledge that he and Copernicus were right, and especially about what the church had put him through, the more amusing the middle finger thrust skyward seemed. I mean, of all the remnants, how perfect is it that with his remaining relic, the old man is eternally flipping the universe the bird. So in the end, it isn't the obscenity of the gesture.
Yeah.
It was the relic of the enterprise, the search for truth, and what that meant.
But she actually takes it and says, given what I know about the middle finger, it's kind of humorous.
Yeah.
So the middle finger was used to point things out, I take it, or to just make...
Well, in some cultures, it's used as the pointing finger.
Yeah.
And when this Austrian student stayed with us, she would point the middle finger because it was the longest one.
Right. So that makes sense. So I could probably see whoever it was, that fellow who took the finger, was thinking, okay, this guy's pointing something out to us. I mean, I'm assuming without...
Yeah, but it's hilarious.
Fleshed
and there's
out.
also, he defiled the body of Galileo to make his own point.
Yeah.
To take the guy's finger.
Yeah, I mean...
Which is bizarre.
I thought maybe his
body had been kept, for.
But this whole thing that she has about looking for truth, and she's talking about in terms of her research on sexual identity. She talks about how a high-up surgeon once told her, right around that same time, honey, you just don't understand. The parents in our clinics can't handle this. This is talking about babies with what they call ambiguous genitalia.
Yes, right. And then they make a decision to have it become a girl or a boy, right?
That's just the way it is. You can't change society.
Whoa. Sorry.
Wow.
Isn't that interesting? And she said, the surgeon telling me this apparently thought that I, a lowly assistant professor not long out of grad school, would simply yield to his authority, which was the whole thing Galileo was against, as did his medical students and residents and the parents of his patients. But I knew the surgeon's central argument, you can't change society, to be simply counterfactual. Here I was, a woman in pants with a PhD. My identity had come into existence only because society had changed. And quite recently, too. But if I recently, let's see here. But if I tried to tell these surgeons that together we could change society, they would see me as wanting to sacrifice babies on the altar of a radical social agenda. So instead I just took to answering these docs with a joking paraphrase of another uppity historian, Winston Churchill. History will vindicate me, and I will write the history.
Which, hence this book.
This book is just wonderful because it just goes through a bunch of stuff like that. But the whole thing of maleness and femaleness is not an easy question because there's such complexity, actually, in terms of the physical and the internal and the psycho, and all that stuff.
Exactly.
And so, her research is, and it's not easy to answer those questions, including the whole question about what's funny looking for one person is actually normal for another. And so she started doing the research on this. But I thought this whole thing, she talks about the Blitzkrieg method. We took every opportunity that came along and sought out any others we thought might work in terms of the academic angle of exploring what was going on.
What was the method again?
Huh?
The method? The Blix something method?
Oh, Blitzkrieg, just not accepting. In other words, you go all out to try to find out what is actually going on. And it has...
Blitzkrieg. You used the word Blitzkrieg. Yeah, okay, I'm with you. Yeah. I thought there was a specific method in science with a name that started with, Blitz that I wasn't aware of. Some kind of
and she just takes on this stuff, topic after topic like this. This one on rabbit holes, and this whole thing about gender identity. But I found this book really absolutely fascinating because she takes on all these things that people think that they know, and then when you look at it, this is kind of an interesting thing. Now because they're so femme, when they dress like women, even before hormonal surgical transition, these folks are talking about men, pass pretty easily as women, which means straight men become interested in them. Needless to say, they pass even better after hormonal and surgical transition. As post-transition women, now that's an interesting phase. They can and happily do take straight men as their sexual partners. So I found this book just really, really fascinating because she's just not accepting, whatever is presented as the truth. In an area that people barely want to talk about. They don't want to talk about that stuff. And then there's another chapter in tangled webs. We're talking about all the different evolvements and trends, and like I said, it's difficult to talk about this because there's so much complexity to it that you can't make stereotypical.
Yeah, you can't make, right, one thing only applies to one situation. You can't make broad statements in many ways.
In this, she's talking about a trans woman known as Cher, whose real name is now widely known to be Charlotte Angelica Chiolta. I found that fascinating, a trans woman, So it's just all this stuff but these tangled webs, because it's important to sort out what's going on, and it's very, very difficult because it's so many different levels involved.
So she's continuing in this book to bring out her own research, but with this question of how the complexities of her particular research bring up Galileo's questioning as well. I mean, it's a great theme because Galileo was asking some pretty fundamental questions, wasn't he, about how do we determine...
How is our world organized?
Right, yeah, and how do you ascertain the difference between belief and actual observable fact? And are the facts that you're observing still true? I mean, anthropologists are social scientists and scientists as well deal with that constantly.
Well, she was saying that the Chicago principles, this is based on a statement by a constitutional law school, Jeffrey Stone at the University of Chicago, came up with this statement called the Chicago Principles, insists that the university's fundamental commitment is to the principle that debate or deliberation may not be suppressed because the ideas put forth are thought by some or even most of the university community to be offensive, unwise, immoral, or wrong-headed. It is for the individual members of the university community, not for the university as an institution, to make those judgments for themselves and to act on those judgments not by seeking to suppress speech, but by openly and vigorously contesting the ideas they oppose. Which makes this book even more pungent because of starting off with Galileo's middle finger, but she's really talking about this whole thing of academic freedom. Mm-hmm. And when you bring up stuff that people don't like, it may have a great amount of worth to it.
You have to have the courage to face what the results are showing you. Yeah.
Well, she talks about the loss of the vigorous, free investigative press, and that is certainly true with this. I immediately thought of the political primaries that are going on right now in the United States, because there is this tendency for the media to decide who's innocent or guilty instantaneously, without even having the facts, just the surfacing of it. She says, I can and will continue to help from the outside now, but American academics, still on the inside, must, as never before, take on the job of defending what it is Galileo must have died wanting: the right to seek, to know, to share ideas and knowledge without undue harassment. The founding fathers did not risk their lives for us to shop and dine. It is much too soon for us to end the Enlightenment. And that's some really interesting stuff. And she talks about, she said, I have managed to accomplish Galileo's middle finger specifically because deans and provosts before them have protected me when they received complaints about my work. Now I face the situation of having call out Northwestern's university on censorship. They told me I could go to Evanston, that is, I could speak to the provost's office, but I should expect the same response, which was they didn't want to publish it. At this point, despite Christie's resignation, I was still staying public, quiet, still worried about my colleagues' jobs. But in the public, Northwestern was looking very bad for another cause. Laura Kipnis, a faculty member in the University School of Communications, had been brought under extensive Title IX investigation by the university following her mockery of the university's sexual harassment policy in the Chronicle of Higher Education. So there's quite a contested thing going on.
She brought her thing.
Her study, her quest into the same context of the Laura Kipnis controversy. And it was sort of like, well, do you want to pile it on? You want to bring it into here because it might actually bring undue whatever the observation or
She pointed out
criticism
that
upon it.
there's one historical story that she wishes activists and scholars would return to because it would help them to see why they have to value the same things. In America in 1776, the Declaration of Independence was finally signed, formally renouncing British rule and articulating a new vision of human liberty. There was no internet in 1776. So John Nixon climbed up on a platform and read the Declaration aloud to assembled crowd. The platform he climbed up in had been erected 7 years earlier and not for political purposes. It was put up in 1769 by the American Philosophical Society so that one of their members, the astronomer David Rittenhouse, could make formal observations of the transit of Venus, the passage of that planet across the face of the sun.
Yeah.
The platform was to put up to look at the sky. If, as the investigative press collapses and no longer can function as an effective check on excess and corruption, and people live and die forever inhabiting self-obsessed corners of the internet and the government and the ad-selling Google industrial complex, ever-increased surveillance on us, and we can't trust people in government to be our advocates or even be sensible. If we have any hope of maintaining freedom of thought and freedom of person in the near and distant future, we have to remember what the Founding Fathers knew. That freedom of thought and freedom of person must be erected together. That truth and justice cannot exist one without the other. That when one is threatened, the other is harmed. That justice and thus morality require the empirical pursuit. So I thought that was, and the other thing in her acknowledgments, she talked about this faithful patron who has financially supported my work since she gave up tenure in 2004. Aaron Sousa supplied not only our son's college fund, 2 roofs, 3 squares, and cash for my, he also provided life-saving companionship, laundry and cooking, editing of unclear drafts and crazy thoughts.
So she lives in Lansing nearby here in Michigan, but doesn't have an academic appointment now.
No. Got run out. And she talks about all the people who support her in her quest for truth. You know, to me, that's what a real scholar is. Is torpedoes be damned, I guess you'd say. You know, and very interesting book, really, and it's the whole thing. If you're going to take on scientific controversy, then you got to be willing to take the stuff that comes with it, which you did. Well, thank you for being on the program.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I always enjoy coming to talk, and we'll do it again, I hope. Yeah.